Now, from somewhere in beautiful downtown Burbank, NBC once more tries to prevent...
What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an artist. Revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. What happens? You're about to find out. It's another episode of Notes from an Artist.
Harvey, want anything special for your birthday?
Just a decent cup of coffee.
You're kidding.
I'm serious. Honey, your coffee's undrinkable.
Pretty harsh.
Well, so's your coffee. You know, the girls down at the office make better coffee on their hot plates. Well, see you later.
And he didn't even kiss me goodbye. You know, if I could just make a decent cup of coffee, I could relax. So, relax. Why don't you try Instant Folgers? Tastes good as fresh perked. Good as fresh perked? I'll surprise Harvey for his birthday tonight.
Hey, great coffee.
It's Instant Folgers. Doesn't it taste good as fresh perked?
Better.
Better than those girls make at the office?
Honey, their coffee can't hold a candle to yours.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Instant Folgers taste good as fresh perked. Try it.
There's no mister, it's just Higgins, sir.
David, we welcome our listener back to another episode of Notes from an Artist. My name is Tom Semioli, and my partner is David C. Gross. David, please greet our listener.
Good morning, dear Karen. How are you today? It was nice to see you at the Peter Frampton benefit. That was a great night. Thanks for showing up.
All right. We're getting very personal with our listener, David.
Oh, well.
Our guest tonight is Jim Higgins, and he's here to talk about his current book, Sweet, Wild, and Vicious, Listening to Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. That is out now on Trouser Press. David,
I thought that was a description of my ex-wife.
I guess my ex-wife, too.
Yeah.
All my exes live in Texas. I wish they did.
And I hear from my ex on the back of my checks.
Let's get back to Lou. Now, Lou Reed began recording with the Velvet Underground in the 1960s, and as a solo artist, he put out about 25 records, and then you look at all the VU reissues and their original records and some of the compilations, and you've got about 50 albums of original music by Lou Reed.
Why do you have so many children? Because I like my wife. I like my cigar, too, but I take it out sometimes.
In Sweet, Wild, and Vicious, Jim delves into everything Lou recorded. He gives us details on who played what, analysis, appraisals that will certainly enhance fans' understanding of Lou. This book is definitely for Lou Reed fans, and it has been praised by such renowned musical journalists as Greg Kot and my University of Miami classmate Tom Moon, and we praise the book too. As well.
Yeah, why not? It's a good book.
It's an excellent book. It examines all the phases Lou went through. Most folks don't know that Lou's love of music started in the doo-wop era in the 1950s. And I think if you listen to all of Lou's vocal work from the VU all the way up until his last solo record of original music, which I believe was Ecstasy in the early double zeros, you'll hear strains of doo-wop in Lou's work. We certainly get into Lou's more experimental side. VU albums such as White Light, White Heat, Lou's Metal Machine music, his collaboration with Metallica, like they used to call that Lou-talica, and his final release in 2008, I believe it was, Hudson River Wind Meditations, which is an ambient new age work. We discussed Lou's glam rock star period with albums such as Transformer and Rock and Roll Animal. For staples on FM radio, you remember FM radio, David?
That's correct. It was the bastion of all the great music that I listened to. Groups like Sweet Thursday, which no one has ever heard of, with Nicky Hopkins and others equally as obscure. That was the great thing about FM radio. Actually, Sirius has one channel that sort of delves a little bit into that, what's called deep tracks.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, a lot of the DJs from New York in the 70s are on deep tracks, 70s and 80s. So
that's true. Does the name Pato mean anything to you?
The name Pato doesn't mean anything to me, Dave.
That's right. It was a great guitarist named Ali Halsall, whose birthday was the 14th of March, and he was one of the Ruddles. He was the fifth Ruddle that got lost in Germany.
I know nothing. Nothing.
I didn't know that. All right, I'll have to check my Ruddles history. But getting back to Lou, David, Lou hung around long enough to be one of rock's premier legacy artists. Casual rock fans only know him from Walk on the Wild Side, but there's much more than that. He was a huge influence on what is considered alternative rock. You'll find all the VU albums on the various lists of albums you must hear. Lou certainly helped establish the language of avant-garde into the rock vocabulary, as did many artists. But Lou and the VU were a tremendous influence on David Bowie, Patti Smith, the Sonic Youth, Joy Division, REM, the Jesus and Mary Chain, you remember those guys, the Strokes, the New York Dolls, Dream Syndicate, et cetera, et cetera. And you could argue, and we do argue, David.
Oh, I don't want to argue.
That the VU rank up there with the Beatles and Miles and James Brown as a huge influence. The only difference with the Velvets is they worked in relative obscurity during their run from 66 to 1970. And it wasn't until the CD era that they were rediscovered because their records were long
Here's a
out of
really
print.
interesting question for you. Do you think, when you think of the Velvet Underground, you think New York specific? Right. When you think of recordings, let's say imports and such, obviously, New York got it first because of the ports. And if there was streaming as well as social media, I'm sure they would have been a much more renowned band than they actually were back then.
I think so. I think if you had peer-to-peer communication other than letters and postcards, yeah, sure, people would have shared files and things like that and told each other about them. Now, you were around more so than I was during the VU. Were they as notorious as as the historians have written about?
Jane, you ignorant slut.
Well, as you hear in the interview that we do, I was really not into it. It was too dark for me. I was a mod. I was into English rock and roll. And at that same time, you had this downtown thing going on. And I really was not impressed with any of it. I like Small Faces. I like the Beatles. I like the Who, Stones. So this actually, in my mind, poorly played music because they were not great musicians, except for maybe John Cale. It just, As a growing musician wanting to be a better player, I pretty well overlooked that entire kind of
thing. The VU were not a musician's band, and that's very interesting. They were more an artist band. And if you look at the bands that, like I mentioned before, that were influenced from, they're not known for their musicianship. They're known for their artistic stance. And I'm the same way in a lot of ways. I didn't get to hear the VU because by the time I came to Lou in the 70s, those records were out of print. But I did admire his backing band, and Lou used the best musicians around. I mean, we talk about him using Don Cherry, later on Fernando Saunders and Tony Smith, and he really used accomplished players, even going back to Berlin. He had Bob Ezrin produce, he had Jack Bruce, Tony Levin on that record.
Right, but if you think about it, you can sort of hide some of the lack of musicianship with great players, but the other thing is, as Lou was going on, is with pretty much any musician, if you're playing every night, you're going to get better.
Yeah.
So his playing even improved.
Oh, very much so. As a matter of fact, if you watch footage of Lou in the early 70s, and you see Lou in the 80s when he really had his artistic resurgence, beginning with Blue Mask in 81 or 82 it was. Again, he's got Fernando, he's got Tony Smith, he's got Fred Maher. Don Perry, I believe, played on one or two Lou Reed records. So you had great players there. And yes, Lou was a much better singer, much better guitar player. He certainly improved from being on the bandstand all those years. So, and that's kind of it's interesting to see people who are heavily influenced from them don't concentrate so much on their musicianship. And I guess that's a good thing and a bad thing in certain ways.
Well, it worked for him. And another thing that he was able to do is after a hit song, he could hire good musicians because he had some dough. And as you know, that's the key to a lot of artists who ended up doing well based on earlier hits.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we have to get Fernando on the show. We've been going back and forth with him. And Fernando was Lou's bass player for the last 30 years of his life. And I remember discussing with Dennis Ferrante, who engineered one of the Lou records, that when Lou came in with a song and Fernando and Tony Smith got a hold of it, it really enhanced what Lou was doing. So Lou knew enough to collaborate with people who had at least more formal training, and look at his work with John Cale. I mean, that was certainly, I think Lou helped John, but John helped Lou quite a bit, turned him on to a lot of things.
Yeah. And I think, when you read Jim's book, you also get a sense that Lou was interested in improving.
Yes.
He was the one who was disappointed in the VU.
Right.
Their musicianship. Exactly. He was not a happy camper in that. It makes sense, with influences like Ornette Coleman and Don Cherry and even Dion. You're thinking in terms of, wow, this guy had a wide berth of interests in music, even classical music. But the caveat to that is back in the early 60s to mid 60s, there was no genre-specific radio.
Mm-hmm.
A good song was a good song was a good song. So if you look at the Billboard charts or the Cashbox charts, you had Frank Sinatra, Louis Armstrong, the Beatles. I mean, there was no delineation.
Right, no segregation, right? It wasn't
an R&B chart,
Right, it wasn't formatted the way it is now once the bean counters started taking over.
Correct.
So, anyway, all right, great to have Jim on the show. But David, first we must do the plugs. Are you ready to get plugged, David?
I have been plugged in for so long, I actually want to get unplugged, to be perfectly honest with you.
David, did you know that Notes from an Artist podcast is in the top 10 percentile of all 3.2 million registered podcasts on the planet Earth, or what's left of it?
Well, Tom, it's not about the money. It's about the money.
It's about the money. David, did you know that Notes from an Artist podcast is heard in 81 countries and territories and over 1,500 cities? And that's not counting the folks listening to us in the fjords and the hamlets and the peninsulas and the...
I just got plugged.
In the fjords, in the desert, in the jungles, in the Amazon rainforest, and the few remaining glaciers and such far off and remote, practically unreachable regions as New Jersey.
Well, the question is, does anyone want to go to New Jersey?
Oh.
And what exit?
Exactly. David, you can hear this podcast anytime you like on Apple, Amazon, Buzzsprout, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are podjumicated. Our listener also has the option of hearing Notes from an Artist on internet radio every Monday evening at 8 p.m. on Cygnus Radio, which can be accessed by way of www.cygnusradio.com. Cue that up on the browser of your choice. David, if you have some spare time, why don't you go on our YouTube page, which has over 100 videos of some of our past guests.
Wow.
And if you even want to learn more about yourself, David C. Gross, go to notesfromanartist.com and you'll see what David Gross is up to every minute of the day. And if you're a baby boomer and you've got nothing else to do but watch Fox News or CNN, well, you can see what we're up to on our Facebook page. It's also interesting to know, David, you and I are working musicians, of course. We don't work together because we both play the same instrument, but sometimes we'll play together. And it's easy to tell us apart. David plays all the notes and I play half the notes.
That's exactly right. I'm the chromatic guy.
All right. And on a good night, you'll catch us be playing between the notes. David leads an ensemble billed as 144, and my group works under the moniker of Spaghetti Eastern Electro Dub. So if you out there in radio and internet land and podcast land dig improvisational music that incorporates jazz, avant-garde, dub, funk, rock, classical, ragas, electronica, dance, and experimental music, and permutations thereof, come out and hear us play. Why not, David?
I have no reason to not invite them.
We play in New York City, Hudson Valley, Long Island. David's performances also include silent film backdrops. So if you can't get to the Sphere in Las Vegas, go see David C. Gross in 144.
My sphere of influence is much less.
Okay, and my collective Spaghetti Eastern Electro Dub has a new live album out called Live at Greenkill Sessions, which you can access on Bandcamp, Spotify, Apple Music. Add that to your playlist, and you can also hear 144 streaming on those platforms as well. David, people can listen to us when we're not talking. David is now silent. One of the rare times. And of course, at the end of this show, you can hang in there that long. We have a fabulous playlist which incorporates some of Lou's work with the Velvet Underground, his solo work, some cool stuff with Dion. We've got Ornette Coleman, and a bunch of others.
Now we don't have to tell you about the playlist because
we've already done it. So I spilled the frijoles. Anyway, let us bring in our guest, Jim Higgins.
Jim is an author. He's a journalist. He covers arts and culture for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. David, that's a newspaper. You remember newspaper.
And that's Milwaukee. That's the place where the Brewers are.
Miller Park, right? Do you go to Miller Park, Jim?
Yes. Although I hate to tell you, it's called American Family Field now, but I do go there. So
okay, it's corporate branding name. Exactly. You're a graduate of Marquette. You live in Milwaukee County. Brewers never won a World Series.
No, they went in 1982, their one and only appearance. That was when they were in the American League, and it was against the Cardinals.
Right, Harvey's Wallbangers. I remember them.
Harvey's Wallbangers. Yep.
Okay, but you do well in basketball.
Of course, they were the Braves. That went to Atlanta.
Good memory, David. Yep. Braves did well. Braves won a champion. There's a famous headline from here about Bushville wins because somebody from the Yankees had referred to the Milwaukee Braves as Bushville. And so, yeah, the old timers here still remember the Braves.
That's right.
Okay. And then, of course, you do well with the Milwaukee Bucks. They won NBA championships with Kareem and Oscar Robertson, right? Okay, and then
and a few years, and with Giannis a few years ago.
Okay, and Marquette won NCAA titles, I recall, didn't they? A couple of times.
79. I was a sophomore there. Yep.
Wow. All right, there we go. Anyway, David, we digress. Jim's first book came out in 2017 on History Press. Wisconsin literary luminaries from Laura Ingalls Wilder to Ayad Akhtar.
You got it.
Okay, David, we're not in that book. We're not Wisconsin luminaries for some reason. Anyway, but we are.
I did play Benke's in Madison.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I've been to Milwaukee. It's a fabulous place. I go on baseball trips, and I hate to tell you, I'm a Met fan.
I'm a loser. I'm a loser.
I know we knocked you out of the playoffs this year. But anyway, we digress. We're here to talk about his current book, Sweet, Wild, and Vicious, Listening to Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. David, it's out now on Trouser Press.
I think I busted a button on my trousers. Hope they don't fall down. You don't want my trousers to fall down now, do you?
And this is, you're also a blogger.
Have you gotten your trousers pressed, by the way?
My trousers are pressed. That's a very prestigious.
Does anyone use the word trouser anymore?
The British.
You might want to ask Ira Robbins that. Maybe the Brits do, or some old people do. So.
We actually want to ask Ira Robbins. I think he'd be a fascinating interview.
Yes, he would be. Now
he would be, and yes, you should get him.
We'll get him, David. We get. Okay. Come on, we're New York luminaries. Two writers who I greatly respect have praised this book. Greg Kot, who's a big influence on you, and one of my favorite rock writers, along with Jim DeRogatis, is Tom Moon. Listen to what Greg Kot said of Jim Higgins. I didn't think we needed another book on Lou Reed or the Velvet Underground until I read Sweet, Wild, and Vicious. They finally get the book that they deserve. It is nothing less than an essential addition to our understanding and appreciation of Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. Wowie zowie. That's some nice praise. High praise. And then Tom Moon. I went to University of Miami with Tom Moon. So there you go. I get that. You give Miami $100 a year and they send you a sweatshirt. Says Tom Moon, David, I have, well, Jim says in the book, I have no unifying theory of Lou Reed to sell you. But Moon mentions Higgins engages at street level, weaving carefully researched details, sharp original descriptions of the music and reaction from artists and tastemakers into a thorough exploration of the sonic realms of this icon visited and then owned. I mean, Jim, really?
Moon needs a thesaurus.
He should write for a living.
He should, yeah. Don't be a writer, as Ralph Steadman said. Don't be a writer. You'll only bring shame on the family. Now, Jim, I consider myself, and David considers me, to be a Lou Reed scholar. I first started buying Lou's records in '75 with Coney Island Baby. I got to play with Lou Reed. I have the bass guitar right there. At the Bowery Ballroom in 2000 as part of a benefit. My band was on the bill with him. I wasn't in his band. He actually performed solo. And we spent about an hour together in one of the dressing rooms at the Bowery Ballroom, just chatting about everything from baseball to guitar gear. And he was a charming, soft-spoken person, very funny, very much a Henny Youngman-like wit, which we hear on Take No Prisoners, which we'll talk about. And not at all like the characters he portrayed in his songs. And it's great when your heroes are the people you'd hope they would be. And when I told him my garage rock band in high school in the 70s played songs from Coney Island Baby, he said to me, man, I make records for guys like you. So he was a stand-up guy. And I'm surprised he never wrote a autobiography, given the popularity of rock stars writing autobiographies. But what inspired a guy like you, a scholar like you from Milwaukee, to write a book about the quintessential New York City rocker, who really was a cult artist?
It's a little bit of a story, Tom. Is that okay to launch into it here?
Yeah, that's what we do.
All right.
That's why you're here.
That's okay.
Ramble on, Jim. Ramble on.
I have been a fan going way back. I am a guy originally from Pittsburgh who went to Marquette and been here since then. And probably my discovery of Lou was freshman year of college. And I'm sure I heard Walk on the Wild Side, but album-wise, it would have been Rock and Roll Animal, which would have been really the first album that got me interested in Lou. And from that point on, I was keeping up with them. And then, of course, retrospectively going back and discovering the Velvet Underground through those records. And at the time in the mid 70s, you kind of had to be a cultist to even find the Velvet Underground records.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Weren't in good distribution. But I was a fan on the ride with Lou pretty much through Ecstasy from that point on. And when I say fan, though, not always an entirely uncritical or adoring fan, because it's a wild ride. His recordings, some are great, some are less so. He was a guy that changed sounds a lot, restless about staying with one thing. Always the core of the songwriting and attitude there, but all the other elements would change. So I was devoted to the music, followed closely. I actually covered pop music here in the 80s, and their definition of that was anything that was not classical, so that included seeing Lou and his peers in that time period. When Lou died in and I'm forgetting the year now, you guys could remind
2013,
me.
I believe. Yeah,
I did a blog thing here just for fun, where I blogged his solo albums. I went back once or twice a week and wrote about one of those solo albums, just as kind of my way of processing the loss, and enjoyed doing that. Some readers liked it. That was fun, and I felt like it was done. And one of my colleagues at the time said, hey, you should really turn this into a book. And I just thought, no, this is done. No one is interested in hearing any more I would have to say on the subject. And that's that. But then following Lou's death, the bios started coming out by Lou. And I read them all, enjoyed them, fascinated by them, but felt frustrated that, the life is so complicated. The bios could only spend so much time on the actual music. And I was reading them and I felt like I wanted more on the music in this context. And this may make you happy, Tom. It was specifically reading one of the bios, and there was one paragraph on Coney Island Baby. And which is one of my personal favorite albums of Lou's, high on my list. And I just thought, there's so much to say here about how that music and how much it fits in his life. And we get one paragraph. And I was talking to my good friend Greg Cott about this. And in his very inimitable way, he just said, "Well, you should write a bio, man. You should do it." And my thought then was is the last thing somebody would need, because so these other folks have greater access. They've done all the research. I don't think there's a definitive bio of Lou to write. I think there's a lot that's unknowable. A lot of those people are gone. A lot of them were either high or damaged during the time period. There's only so much additional fact you can recover, but I still thought there was room to write about the music, and that's what I decided to do. And the first take on this book was pretty personal. You could even say eccentric. I was using as my model, if you've ever seen the books from the University of Texas Press that are on individual artists like the Beach Boys or Beyonce or other people. And I'm forgetting the name of the series, but it's a series of books, and they were very essay oriented. And that was my first take on this.
Is that the 33 and a third series?
No, it's not that.
Okay.
Let me find the name of what it is. It's not for beginners, but dang, it's something like Explained or what? No, oh, it's Why So and So Matters. It's like why the Beach Boys matter, why Beyonce matters. It's a good series. I wrote it in the style of one of those books. It was all essays. So there was just one on Lou's guitar playing and one on the last run of albums and what you could learn from them, and one on songs about Warhol. And so it was very topically written. And I was, while understanding at the time, there might only be 5 people who would want to read this thing. I felt happy with it, and my readers felt happy with it. But there was complete indifference from publishers. A few were nice enough to say, we like this. Well, a few said we like this writing, but this. And it's true, there's been a lot written about Lou, but we couldn't sell it. And that's a fair statement to make. And always in the back of my mind was my thought, well, I could publish this myself for the 100 people who might read it if I had to. Ira Robbins was the one person who said, like the writing, could never sell this book. If you would consider redoing it album by album, I would strongly consider publishing. Took 6 months. Reworked everything, went back to the holes, there's specific albums I hadn't dealt much with, and went through all those. And I found that I didn't feel resentful about it. I found that it worked. I was able to take that earlier work on topics and work them into individual chapters. Now, I made it a point that I had to listen to everything fresh at least once. So that means like hours with the Quine tapes, and it means actually listening to every sound of Metal Machine music and all the other things. So that, I wanted to be able to say whether you like or agree with what I wrote or not. I have listened to everything fresh here. Ira was an excellent editor, a good copy editor, and there were a few structural ideas. And so I'm really grateful for his editing. And a lot of people may not read this book, guys, but I'm happy with how it turned out. And I like to think it's for the person who knows a little about Lou or Velvet Underground, but wants to know more. The guys that are experts might know everything in here already and might not agree with my takes, but there's younger people coming up, who are going to want to discover them.
Well, that's interesting how you got it published by Trouser. And I will tell you, as a Lou scholar, there were things I didn't know. There were a lot of things I didn't know because, as you mentioned, in the 1970s, you could not find a Velvet Underground album. Now, I grew up in Long Island, Nassau County, in Valley Stream, which is 2 towns away from Freeport. Okay, and David was born and raised in New York City, and the record stores didn't even have Velvet Underground sections. Okay, and so it's very interesting when I hear people like Michael Stipe and all these people cite the Velvet Underground. I'm like, you lived in Athens, Georgia. I lived on Long Island. I couldn't find a Velvet Underground album other than that reissue, the Maxes and the one that you mentioned, 69, and
yes.
Very rare until the CD age when everything started getting reissued. But, it's interesting about the Velvet Underground. Again, their influence, but I was like, well, how did people get a hold of these records? You do so very well in this book. You point out that Lou was an innovative artist who brought the avant-garde and experimental music into the language of rock and popular music. We take that for granted now. You do talk about how he used his limitations as a vocalist, and it's brilliant comparisons. Johnny Mercer, Sammy Cahn, Bob Dylan. Leonard Cohen. That's what Lou did, and he used the recording studio as and concert stage as a canvas for sound. That all comes out in your anecdotal coverage of each record. But the Velvet Underground really went unnoticed by the masses. It wasn't until later on that they got their due.
Ahead of their time. And certainly counter to the currents of their time. And as you guys know, as professional musicians, distribution is everything. If people can't find what you do, no one's going to hear what you do.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because growing up in Manhattan, not only are you getting all the records that are coming out, you're also getting all the imports that are coming from Europe, England in particular. My take on Velvet Underground is way different than Tom's. I was a spoiled prep school kid. I would go down to the Village, see band, but the Velvet Underground scared me. I thought that was a really dark, I didn't want to get into. The thing I liked about the first album was the banana, because you could peel it on the original record. So for me, there was no love lost. And I thought it was interesting, because culturally, I was much more a mod than a downtowner. I liked what was coming out of Britain way more than I liked what was going on in America. It oddly wasn't until later on, because I was one of those kids who was into the real avant-garde. I used to go to a place on the Lower East Side, way down on Avenue C and D, called Slugs, to go see avant-garde jazz. I was also interested in avant-garde classical music. So when Metal Machine came out, that turned me on, where you had a totally different view on that, Jim.
Yes. That all makes sense, though, Dave.
Yeah.
Metal Machine's not really music to me. I mean, I can't say I'm as strong a avant classical listener as you are, though I do some. It's funny now, I write about classical musicians all the time now here. It's just Metal Machine is very interesting sound, but I just don't hear it as music. And I guess my sensibility is I like noise as a condiment, not an entree. So Metal Machine challenges me, but it is still really fascinating. And if RCA had treated it like an avant classical record rather than just whipping it out there, maybe it would have, taken hold a little better.
You're absolutely right, because RCA had a very, think about it. And of course, Bowie plays into Lou Reed again. One of Bowie's most famous records is his narration to Tchaikovsky's, Peter and the Wolf,
right?
Which was on RCA's classical label.
So Dave, there's this. If you haven't heard it, I'm looking it up here to find the name of it. This I think it's a German guy who did a chamber orchestra rearrangement of Metal Machine music. And that's really interesting to listen to, because I think one of the things that troubles me about Metal Machine is the weirdness of not being able to tell what instrument makes the sound. I mean, we know it's guitar and guitar feedback,
right.
But it doesn't really sound like guitar playing. But when you hear like that, it rearranged on instruments, even though it's still the same weird sound, you have enough of the identity of the instruments that
it's easier to prove to you that I read your book. I found those records with the saxophone.
I trust you.
And you're absolutely right. Tom will tell you a lot of the stuff that I do now is very sound oriented. I'm not as impressed with the pitches, so to speak, as much as the sonics that come out of it. And that German guy did a fantastic version of Metal Machine. Absolutely. But it still was metal because he was playing saxophone.
Right.
I
just imagine the conversations he had going to the other musicians and say, here's what we're going to do on our next project here. Yes.
But then you fast forward to the Hudson Wind, which plays so directly into Metal Machine. It's conceptually the same thing. And you have to admit, Laurie Anderson must have had a serious influence on what Lou was doing.
Yes, that would be a good project for someone to do is to sort that out, because the things they do physically together don't make a huge impact on me. I don't dislike them, but their worlds are kind of separate. But certainly he picked up the sense of permission from her to do different things. And
absolutely.
I mean, I love the Laurie Anderson Kronos Quartet album, which is all about it's a concept thing about the big flood that happened out where you guys live a few years ago.
Right.
And there's a certain amount of noise on that. So I love her stuff that way. Her as a guest on his albums, pretty minimal impact. But yes, I think she gave him a lot of permission to be an artiste, which he always sort of was, but had to smuggle that in his other agendas.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting about Metal Machine Music, which threw us for a loop, is that the cover of the album is Lou in his rock and roll animal outfit. And it really didn't tell you.
Yes.
It was very misleading. And fortunately, in those days, Jim, as you remember, and David, we would read things known as record reviews. And they warned us what was in the album. And it was a double album, which cost, an unbelievable $8 in 1975, which was a lot of money back then for an album. So we stayed away from it. So that added to the confusion. One of the things you bring out in the book, and this was fascinating when you talk about Mo Tucker of the Velvet Underground, and I will quote you here, she didn't have the idiosyncratic swing of Ringo or the thunder of John Bonham or the antic mania of Keith Moon. But I didn't know this. As a teenager, Tucker became a fan of Nigerian drummer Babatunde Olatunji.
Right.
And she actually got him to appear at her high school in Levittown, Long Island, David, Levittown, Long Island, because she was enamored with Drums of Passion, that 1960 record. And now when I hear Velvet Underground, after learning this, I can say, oh, yeah, now it makes sense, because my friends are drummers. Oh, she stinks. She was not a good drummer. But now I understand where she was coming from. And that was something I didn't know. She played cymbals as little as possible because she didn't want to interfere with the singers and the high-pitched instruments. So
but with that, Tom, you're absolutely right about influences. If you listen to Church of Anthrax, the John Cale record, you can understand a lot of what was going on that first Velvet Underground record. Now, once again, in having fresh ears with that record, I have a much different opinion of it than I did back then. Back then, it was much more cultural. It really, really was. They were dark people. That whole Warhol scene, no matter how much people touted, that was a bunch of sick folks. And they were really twisted, and I understand why they did what they did, and I can accept what they did now. But back then, as a 13-year-old boy, man, I didn't want to go anywhere near it. Give me Jimi Hendrix. Give me flowery shirts with ruffles. No heroin or amphetamines for me, sir.
Well, Jim, it's interesting. David and I, we play in the East Village. We have friends down there. And it's a very weird scene, because what David and I noticed is that, and we talk about this all the time, that, what's that?
We don't fit in.
We don't fit in, right. Because we're educated musicians.
We're too bourgeois.
We're bourgeois. Yeah, exactly. Well, look. Anyway, losing my train of thought. That when people like Lou Reed and Patti Smith and David Byrne, when their records became hits and they had a few bucks in their pockets, they got the hell out of the East Village. The East Village was dangerous. People talk about, New York City was gritty and it was cool back then. And then we had one interviewee in David's wife Nancy's doing a documentary on the East Village. Oh, yeah, I remember walking out of my front door and seeing somebody get their head blown off from a drug deal. And I was like, David, call me old-fashioned. I live in Manhattan. I like walking out on the sidewalk and seeing maybe a cab or, a doorman. I don't relish those times. So, yes, I can understand David's translation of the Velvet Underground as being dark and seedy, because the East Village, even in the 80s, when I moved into Manhattan, was rough. It was not a pleasant place to be. Now, of course, it's gentrified, and you take a walk on the Wild Side and you're on Millionaire's Row. So it's a different neighborhood now.
Well, and Tom, and even in the later 80s, that's the whole background to the New York album.
Yes, right.
Lou being savage about how messy and screwed up and everything he thought was wrong with New York at the time. Yeah. There's a cycle to young people move to the cool, dark, gritty neighborhood, and then when they can afford to, they move somewhere else. That's just part of the cycle of human experience.
Right, and then those neighborhoods gentrify. We had what was it? The
Yeah.
author Jesse Rifkin on called "The Place to Be." You would enjoy that book, Jim. It's all about the history of clubs in New York. And yes, he's what is the quote he gave us, David? Something you know your neighborhood is done when the artists start moving in.
That's it. That's it. Yeah.
You know, but yes, it's interesting to see how Lou in the '80s became an elder statesman because now rock artists were being considered legacy artists. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame came along, and it was great to turn on my TV and see Lou Reed doing a scooter commercial, Honda scooter. You know,
Beats walking.
Yeah.
Beats walking.
Yes,
Lou said in that.
But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You talk about how Reed wrote about drug experience as at a time when the Beatles were coding theirs. You know, Lou was very open about that, and I think obviously that was part of his appeal. Interesting. You talk about street hassle. Like me, like you, I didn't hear binaural sound. I didn't know what the hell.
Yeah.
The records didn't sound any different. They sounded kind of muddy, but it's interesting that Lou started choosing musicians that recorded for ECM around that time because he was getting more into jazz, rock and roll hard, and the bells.
Could Lou have played that music himself? Maybe not, but he certainly had the ears for the great musicians. And his saxophone, Marty Fogel, his saxophonist, said that Lou wanted that band to be like a band. He said Lou could be a dictator in a lot of ways, but not on the bandstand. He wanted them to play like a band. He wanted them to have a certain amount of freedom to do what they did. And he obviously had ears for good players.
Well, he did.
You gentlemen who are bass players know.
Well, we're going to talk about Fernando in a minute, but the bells, Lou has Don Cherry on that record. And a very good observation you had is that the black musical styles that Lou embraces wouldn't have been out of place on a Springsteen or a Southside Johnny album. My feeling is, yeah, but Lou just didn't have the vocal chops to pull it off, especially on songs like The Family, where he's too whiny, whereas Bruce would have been more gritty. Yeah. And then, of course, you tell the story of how Springsteen makes his guest appearance on Street Hassle, which shocked me when I had that album in 1977, when it was, because Bruce was in litigation at the time and he couldn't record, so he's sort of he's uncredited on that. But yeah, let's talk about the rebirth for me in '82 with Robert Quine, my bass hero Fernando Saunders, and Fred Maher, and later Tony Smith. Lou really flexed his artistic chops and had a band that could run with him, but enhanced what he was doing. David and I talk about Fernando. What I love about him and his approach to the bass is he can make one chord. He can make 3 chords sound like 300 chords or 3 chords. And I was friends with the late great Dennis Ferrante, who was an engineer, I think, on Blue Mask. And he said to me, when Lou did the first run-throughs, it was okay. But when Fernando came in, that's when the album came together, when he added his harmonic genius to it.
I mean, he's and a lot of the tracks of that era, Fernando's really the lead instrument.
Yeah.
He's the most prominent. Lou and Quine, they have certainly lead moments, but a lot of times they're kind of playing a double rhythm guitar, rhythm plus guitar, and you hear Fernando just come surging forward. And we're allowed to talk about beauty in a Lou Reed discussion. Fernando's a beautiful player. You just hear a few of those notes, and it just makes you swoon a little bit when you hear
well,
his
what's really interesting about Fernando too is, first of all, playing fretless in a rock thing was and still is a very different thing, and playing fretless in a rock thing and not sounding like Jocko is even more incredible. And there were so many bass players that around that time, or maybe a little earlier, picked up the fretless bass. There are very few that have created their own sound. I mean, Mick Karn, Percy Jones, and Fernando seem to me to be the 3 biggest proponents. Maybe you could throw in Tony Franklin from The Firm as well. He was kind of unique in his style. But think about Fernando. Some people pick up a fretless bass specifically for the vocal quality. And I think if you rethink what Fernando was doing with Lou from a vocal perspective, it makes a great deal more sense.
And Jim, just go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom, please.
Well, I was just going to say, and you talk about the boldness of my my co-host here, David and I. We did a series of benefits notes from an artist, where we did tributes to the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Faces, Humble Pie. We had members of band, people from Bob Dylan's band and Ian Hunter's band and things. And David went out and played these songs. We split the bass duties. David brought a fretless bass, Humble Pie and the Beatles. So this guy he's a tough guy, David C. Gross.
Well, I did play a fretted bass when I was in Humble Pie, but nowadays, if it has no frets, I fret less.
Thing also is Fernando could also play the really hard, fast stuff too.
Yes,
he did both of those things extremely well. And Waves of Fear, one of my favorite tracks from that time. He's part of the power stack of that. And live on Italy, there's plenty of big power moments from Fernando, and the gentle moments too. And that's a stadium concert.
Yeah,
live in Italy. So,
yeah, one of my favorites.
And he's still, like I wrote in the book, on Ecstasy. I thought by that point I knew all the ways that Fernando played, and then on Tatters, there's this sort of rumbling bass thing that doesn't feel like anything else he plays, and it's perfect. So he clearly didn't stop running out of things he could do in blues band.
Yeah. We hope to have Fernando on the show. He's done quite a few solo records. Actually, I remember seeing. Towards the end of Lou's life, I remember seeing a solo Fernando show, the Fernando Saunders Band, at a place in the West Village. What's that place right off Astor Place? Joe's Pub. And Lou was in the audience. And, very supportive of what Fernando was doing. Now, your favorite Lou album, you say Lou's album, New York, is your favorite. And it's interesting because when I bought that record, obviously the day it came out, it sounds like Lou was just having a conversation with his listener. If you sat at a bar in New York City, you would hear everything that Lou Reed says on New York about, Kurt Waldheim and Jesse Jackson and the Halloween parade.
That is so right on, Tom. And Robert Christgau wrote about that it sounds like, a cab driver discussion about New York, the album. So, I think Fred Meyer's genius on that was putting Lou up front, making Lou front and center. And I don't know how you guys feel about Rob Wasserman, but just wonderful playing on that record. Wonderful playing that's more, reserved than Fernando, not as prominent, but just fit in beautifully in that band. And I did see that tour, which would puncture your loose stereotypes because he was very polite to the audience, very professorial, and a terrific group.
Well, one of the things I wanted to mention to you, I saw the Take No Prisoners tour, okay? And it's one of the great rock and roll comedy albums. I'll have to play it for David. And that's how Lou was in person. Now, he's not as mean. He's quick with the joke. When I saw that tour in a small club on Long Island, my father's place. Lou's Henny Youngman persona was on full display, but on record, you can't see him smiling and wink. So you kind of know that Lou was like, he sounds vicious on the record, but you see him laughing when he's doing it. So I thought that was a very interesting thing. But I love what he did in the 90s. It's interesting that you put a postscript on Christgau and his musings and his opinions and things. It's really, you go back and you see how important rock critics were, because we had no streaming services and we had no YouTube. And when I was in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, there was a 10-page letter under glass written by Pete Townshend to the editor of Rolling Stone at the time. I guess it was Jan Wenner, must have been in 1973, lambasting him for only giving Quadrophenia 3.5 stars. And Christgau, goes after Lou, but to somebody, and David and I read The Village Voice, it really didn't resonate that much with us. But you do go toe to toe with him on quite a few topics.
Well, I wanted to have fun there with Lou's rant about Christgau and Take No Prisoners, and really the takeaway from that little piece is that Christgau was pretty favorable to Lou. Those are pretty good marks, all in all. And so Lou was maybe a little, like you say, we don't see how much Lou's winking when he's delivering that rap.
Right.
Lou was pretty tough on the man. Since we're old guys reminiscing here, I certainly looked a lot to Rolling Stone for reviews, but you gentlemen probably also remember Musician, Player, and Listener. That magazine.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Musician And that was a huge influence for me because they wrote both about rock and jazz stuff. And
Yes.
Stereo Review was very
good writing in
important, too.
there and
Yeah.
smart reviews. Yes, Stereo Review too. And so those, I learned a lot. I kept up with a lot from those. It's like sports writing today. There's still plenty of good sports writers, but the sports magazines are ebbing where you could do longer things. And so
They're gone.
that is a loss for
Well,
so we have to jump in with books and podcasts to help out the youth.
Jim, I think another thing that is different, and Tom and I do talk about this a lot, probably not in our shows, but to one another, because we usually talk every day for at least an hour. One of the things we talk about is musicians versus civilians. Now, what I mean by that is, let's as a for instance, take my wife, for instance.
Take my wife, please, Dave.
She has certain Spotify playlists that she goes back to over and over and over. The musicians can listen to it once, file it for research, give me a different playlist. So for us, when we read the reviews back then, okay, yeah, sure, maybe for something new. But just like RCA had Lou Reed in his rock and roll regalia, metal music, there are people that they believe would go into the store. Oh, it's a new Lou Reed album. Get up, go home, and get pissed off. But they've already purchased the record, so there you go. The thing with record reviews for the civilians, yes, they're going to check out their particular favorite journalists. Rolling Stone could do no wrong. The Paz and Jop of Chris Segal. Oh, yeah. So for someone like me or for Tom, 9 out of the 10 records we've either heard, bought, or don't want to listen to, but that one that we haven't heard, we're going to listen to him regarding it, whether he's right or wrong. Like I say, it's different for musicians. It really is. Now, for me, Metal Music Machine spurred a lot of other things that I was listening to, but I must tell you, it really wasn't until I saw the Dylan movie about 3 weeks ago that lyrics were even important to me. I know that sounds crazy, but as a kid growing up trying to be a musician, I don't care what you're talking about. I want to know what you sound like. I want to know, what chord is that? How do I do this, do that? Lou Reed is a very similar concept to me lyrically now, just 3 weeks later. My God, than he was when his records were coming out, because, oh, sure, everyone loves Walk on the Wild Side, the two different bass players. How much better for me? What more meat do I need? Well, maybe a third bass player. But you know what I'm saying? You get how I view these things and how that has changed over the years as I get older and older.
It's good to see you catching up, David, with the words here. So, but I totally appreciate why sound would be important. Of course, it would, because that's why you became a musician.
Right, but it's also the nature of bass players. We are all about song structure and sound and tone. You know, we're not so concerned about the lyrics and things. You know, because that's we're on the bottom end. But getting back to rock journalism. You know, I got fired from allmusic.com because I wrote too much about music, and the editors want sizzle and talking about haircuts, and that's a problem. You know, that's what happens to rock journalism. But and of course, Zappa's great quote, David, is it's people who can't write interviewing people who can't talk for people who can't read. Now, but in the digital era, what is the role of a rock journalist? Now, audiences can hear music for themselves and make up their minds, right? They can go, and artists now can go directly to an audience. If Jim Higgins writes a lousy review of the new David C. Gross album, 144, which is out now on Spotify.
Thank you very much.
You know, just a little plug for you, David. You know, people could say, why do I need to read Jim Higgins? I got the link right here.
Well, one answer is they don't. But another answer is how much is out there? You know?
Yeah.
We all need paths into the billions of songs that are out there, and maybe, like with other forms of journalism, maybe critics or writers won't be as prominent, but there's still a role for people who can help lead people to what's worth hearing. Because the whole everybody can find people on themselves thing is fine if you're imagining a world with unlimited time, which none of us have. And isn't word of mouth still important to all of us?
It is to
Isn't
us,
Tom interested in an album if David says, "Hey, this is really good, Tom"? So the music journalist can be that word of mouth person. They're just hitting a lot more mouths and a lot more ears.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. Well, and another great things, recordings I didn't know about, Glenn Campbell's rendition of Jesus. And there's a live version of this on the Troubadour record he did live at the Troubadour, Glenn Campbell. And he introduces it. And he goes, "Who did this song?" And someone in the audience yells out, "Oh, Velvet Underground." He goes, "Oh, yeah." And Glenn Campbell does a beautiful version of Jesus. I didn't know that existed. And Lou and Pavarotti, Perfect Day. And it's very funny to hear this. I didn't know that existed either. See, I don't read Jim Higgins enough, David. That's my problem.
Now you will.
Now I will. Luciano phrases like a guy who works at the kitchen at Arturo's Pizza in Houston Street. We'll take you there when you come to New York. "Oh, it's such a perfect day. Mamma mia, spicy meatball. You just keeping me hanging on." And and Lou's in there. It's towards. I guess he was not in good health, 2009 or whenever it was. But that's another one that I had no idea that record existed.
There's a lot of respectful to weird cover versions of Lou Reed and Velvet Underground songs late, and it is fun to go through them. And
yeah, you do.
It's also fun to see who really does something with them as opposed to just try to copy Lou. Perfect Day is a good litmus test because a lot of people don't pick up the troubling undercurrent. They just focus on the idea of the perfect day. And so I have a lot of respect for the versions that are faithful to the troubling undercurrent in the songs.
Yeah, I enjoyed the Perfect Day. I like Duran Duran's version of it. One of David's favorite bands, Duran Duran. And I do like, that's where you got your eye.
Sarcasm on 10.
No, that's where David gets his eyewear and his jewelry from. Duran Duran fan club. He doesn't tell you that he's in the. And of course, REM's Femme Fatale is great. Talk about one of the great moments in rock and roll, and it hasn't been officially released. I attended Bowie's 50th birthday party at Madison Square Garden, and Lou came out and duetted with him on Queen Bitch, which is about the Velvet Underground. And Lou's voice kind of gave out. It was raspy, but they did tremendous versions of Waiting for the Man, and they did Dirty Boulevard. But these are songs now that have, now they're in the rock and roll lexicon, and you're hearing other people cover them. So it's kind of good to see Lou get his due in that sense, that of, not being that one hit or two hit wonder, Walk on the Wild Side.
Yeah. And give it up for David Bowie, who, almost before anybody else in the world heard those Velvet acetates and knew this was good and wanted to do it, so way back when, and obviously the taste Bowie had, and if Bowie and Mick Ronson don't produce Transformer, who knows how much of Lou we would have gotten to hear.
No career. No, he wouldn't have.
One of those.
Same thing with Iggy Pop.
Yes.
And I saw that Iggy tour with Bowie at piano.
Yes, I saw. Right.
And Blondie was the opening.
TVI. Yeah.
Yeah, Blondie was the opening act. And we all kind of were wondering, was this really a Bowie tour that's masquerading as an Iggy tour? No, Bowie sat at the piano, drank from his bottle. It was a terrific show. And this is an opinion to get me in trouble, but I'm actually a bigger fan of 80s Iggy than of the Stooges. Stooges are fine, but it's that Bowie era Iggy. The songs are so sharp, the 5'1", I'm bored.
Yeah, that's new values. Yeah,
those are the things that really matter to me most with Iggy.
Well, he used Bowie's band on those records, on The Idiot, and then what was it, Lust for Life? That's Tony Sales. That's the Sales Brothers.
Yes.
One of my favorite Iggy records, which Bowie had a hand in, but I think they had a kerfuffle, was Blah Blah Blah, which is an excellent record. I think Bowie started producing that, and then they got off on. But I love also that and this again, I didn't know this existed. The Bottom Line archive, where he's with Chris Christopherson, and they're both interviewed by Vin Scelsa, and that was just absolutely fascinating.
That if people ask me, so what's the obscure Lou thing you should check out? It would be that recording. one, you have Vin is the challenge of trying to get Lou to talk, which is entertaining to hear that in itself. But Lou's remarks on the songs are excellent, and Christopherson, he has a catalytic effect on Lou on that. He draws Lou into some conversation, some banter, the song choices. That is such a fun recording to listen to, and I solo Lou acoustic sort of things can be hit and miss, but he sings and plays pretty well on that recording too. And so, yes, I hope your listeners will check that out on streaming services.
And the mutual
that's a really
admiration.
Fun record.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yes.
When you talk about, go ahead. As you were saying,
and Chris is a really good songwriter too. If you're not really a Christopherson guy and you're a rock guy, it's worth hearing him and his songs too. And
I think he never gets the
think about the differences in how they wrote.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. He doesn't get the due. And also, even though there were shitty movies, he did a good job in them.
Yeah.
And they were all shitty movies. Even
the
one with Babs. But he was good. He had acting chops. He was very much like Chris Walken, who played in a lot of shitty movies. That was his work. And there's something to be said about someone who is a working actor / musician, and he did his job.
Yes, and David plans on duetting with Babs Streisand. I think she should.
That's it. We're going to do our own version of Metal Machine.
Yeah, well, David, you've got gigs coming up in Harlem at Sylvana. You should invite Miss Streisand.
That's it. Yeah.
But you talk about Lou albums. Obviously this is a compendium of Lou albums and reviews. I think when I look at Lou, these albums were made for their time. Like, I moved to New York City with my girlfriend in 1984. So New Sensation, which was a happy, upbeat album, and I was a young person without the responsibilities and aches and pains of older adulthood. That album, when I hear it, I think 1984. Just like when I hear New York, I think 1989. New York is in fiscal trouble. It's the Dinkins administration, and things are falling apart. So, I think that's one of the things also that I kind of get from this book is that he was an artist of his time and, documented the times as they were. When New York got gentrified, he sang about a gentrified New York, just like the Velvet Underground sang about, when the Lower East Side was derelict. How do you think Lou will be remembered?
I think it's a great songwriter and as a presence. You can't really separate that persona of the guy in the leather jacket, the rebel, the sort of caustic person. He was a great songwriter. Lou's Mount Rushmore, Heroin, Rock and Roll, Sweet Jane, Waiting for the Man. Even before you get to the solo stuff, those are gonna last. Those are gonna endure. And on the liner notes for 1969, Elliot Murphy wrote about the fantasy of 100 years from now, parents discovering their kids are listening to something, and they said, "What's the name of that band?" It's the Velvet Underground, and the parents are scared. That's not going to go away. Lou helped in a different way than Dylan. He opened possibilities for other musicians and people in rock to write about anything they wanted to, as you guys said, bring in some avant-garde elements into the sound of music, to be responsive to their times, to go against the currents of what's popular. He lit a trail there, and I think as long as people are listening to this music, there's a place for him.
Yeah. There's a lot of similarities between Dylan and Lou. Okay, so Jim, where can we buy this book on Trouser Press?
You can buy it directly from trouserpressbooks.com. Okay. You can buy it from Amazon or any of the big online booksellers. I learned this from Ira recently. There is an audiobook version, which surprised me, but it's a machine voice, but it's a pretty good one. I listened to some of it, and
is it a metal machine?
Is it a metal machine voice?
Yes. It might be a metal machine, but it's a little more variety than that. And it's available as an ebook from all the usual places you get ebooks from. So start either with Trouser Press Books .com or Amazon.
All right. It's interesting, David, because David and I love audiobooks. We took a long trip up north and we listened to Dick Cavett read his books online.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. So anyway, well, Jim, thanks for being a guest. Thanks for putting up with us for an hour.
It's a pleasure to talk with you guys and hear this, and hope I didn't step on your lines too many times.
No,
but thanks for the opportunity.
That's the nature of our show. And when you come to New York, David and I will take you out to Arturo's Pizza. Leave the gun, take the cannoli. That's what we say here. So
anyway. that'd be awesome.
All right. Great. And we'll let you know when this airs, and we'll give you links to the podcast so you can blow up the internet like a Kardashian, sell a bunch of books, because I know you live a very lavish lifestyle there in Milwaukee.
From your mouth to God's ear. There we
go. What's your next project, Jim?
Thank you guys both. I appreciate it.
What's the next book? What's the next book?
Don't know yet. Still got to do
good
the
title
jobs. So we're doing that, and we're
good title.
Yeah, don't know that yet. So we'll see.
All right, Jim. Thanks for being our guest. We'll keep in touch. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you both. Be well.
Thank you, Jim Higgins, for being our guest, David. As we mentioned in our intro, we have a fabulous playlist. Why don't you tell our audience member what's on it?
We've got Ornette Coleman, as Tom ably said in the preview. Some Lou Reed solo, some Velvet Underground, some John Cale with Lou Reed, a Mock the Hoople song, David Bowie. And we've got the Metal Music Machine, stuff that I really, really like, that is very, very bizarre and very, very cool. What else do we have? Oh, we have a Lou Reed song by Brian Ferry, a great interpretation.
And we have Billy Idol doing Heroin, yes?
That,
well, on
way to go
the song
that,
Heroin, we're not going
I really don't know what to say about that.
We don't go into Billy's personal life.
It's a great playlist. I hope you guys enjoy it, and we will see you next week with something new.
Something new. Tom Semioli saying, Seacrest out.
David Gross saying, bye-bye.
Through unforeseen circumstances, this show will remain on the air until further notice.